Good day. It's nice to see you again. I would like to talk with you today about the lunacy, as we now know it to have been, of the lockdown. On May the 17th, 2020, a supremely important opinion piece was published in the Sunday Times. This fact means that of the Sunday newspaper purchasing public, just over 17% had access to the Noble Lord Sumption's opinions, writing and conclusions. Lord Sumption has got a great deal of sway as far as this observer stands, he being a former Supreme Court judge, a law lord, a supremely well-educated lawyer, and, by the sounds from his Reith lectures, a decent bloke. He wrote of the initial stratagem behind the slogans and the lockdown, of the initial decisions and the lunacy of a 180-degree about-turn when the truly questionable mathematical modelling was presented as absolute fact by the idiot Professor Neil Ferguson. He, for those who need reminding of the absolute farce of a modelling strategy which cost Great Britain the vast majority of our most valuable cattle herds and sheep flocks during the foot and mouth disaster by adding animals in contiguous fields to the totals. This modelling, later criticised by contemporaries as deeply flawed, foretold of 500,000 deaths, when more serious modelling may have foretold 50,000 deaths. This panicked the Cabinet and forced the lockdown into full-on driving mode. Prime Minister Johnson stated, "I must level with the British public. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time." And he was speaking fairly factually. However, Lord Sumption also quotes Health Minister Hancock, he of the CCTV, when he made this grotesque remark, "If you go out, people will die." This crass statement is but typical of a bunch of politicians who have dug themselves a big hole and are preparing for further excavations. As the lockdown times have passed into history, many of the mistakes are coming out of the gloom into the full glare of a public's unblinking gaze, and we are now beginning to see the scale of the disaster which was pushed upon us because nobody ever thought to listen to the sceptics, of which there were many, but also because no one ever thought that stoking public fear was not, perhaps, the best way to approach something which had never been seen before in this nation. Our very basic freedoms were taken from us, and this action was based upon questionable advice, where so-called scientists' advice was given priority over ministers' profound worries and concerns. Our economy was devastated. Billions upon billions of pounds which never existed were thrown at a target which was never defined, and it was all based on a set of slogans so false as to set the nation's teeth on edge. After former Chancellor Sunak stated that he was worried enough to protest, but was ignored, after he saw that so-called scientific meetings' minutes were edited to remove double doubts and queries. This is when he spoke out during the political hustings for Prime Minister. The former Justice Sumption writes, again in the Sunday Times, paywall so I cannot copy his words, but I shall attempt to give the viewer some idea of his thoughts. Just hold on a second. Now of course, an absent-minded man must go and get his glasses. Lord Sumption writes, lockdown was an extreme and unprecedented response to an ancient problem, the challenge of epidemic disease. It was also something else. It marked one of the greatest and gravest governmental failures of modern times. In a remarkably candid interview with The Spectator, Rishi Sunak has blown the gaff on the sheer superficiality of the decision-making process of which he himself was a part. The fundamental of good government is not to make radical decisions without understanding the likely consequence. It seems obvious, yet it is at that most basic level that the Johnson government failed. The tragedy is that this is only now being acknowledged. It's a fairly long piece, so I shall attempt to pick out the best bits, or the worst bits rather. The critical question was never a scientific one, it was a political one, at which the likely hospital admissions and deaths from COVID was just one element. The scientists said that it was not their job to think about the social or economic implications of their advice. They were right about that. The problem was that it turned out to be no one else's job either. We are still paying for this negligence, Lord Sumption said, and our children and grandchildren will be paying for it for decades to come. In 2020, the UK GDP fell by nearly a tenth, the biggest hit to the economy for at least a century. According to Treasury estimates, 460,000 people left the workforce, never to return. The policy took a wrecking ball to the public finances. The IMF estimates that the government's spending rose by more than £400 billion, or about £6,000 for every man, woman, child, and of course, refugee. Most of this was unproductive spending. It went on paying people for not working and supporting businesses forced to cease operations. He went on later on, children lost 2 terms of face-to-face schooling. The closure of schools, training establishments and university slowed the accumulation of skills, reducing productivity. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has estimated the cost to the economy at somewhere between 90 and 350 billion pounds. The best off, with plenty of resources and savings at home, will survive. Those who are already disadvantaged will be permanently damaged. Existing inequalities will grow a lot worse. Lord Sumption goes on, the results illustrated after the lack of wider deliberation and scrutiny leads to decisions being made on the hoof without proper forethought, planning or research. It promotes loyalty at the expense of wisdom and flattery at the expense of objective advice. It encourages overconfidence, banishing moderation and restraint. It was only the weakening of the Prime Minister's political authority after the Owen Affair scandal that emboldened a supine cabinet to overrule him and his advisers for the first time in December last year, when the NHS feared being overwhelmed by the Omicron variant. Ministers and scientists responsible for a policy that has inflicted untold misery on an entire population naturally find it hard to admit they may have been mistaken. But closing ranks against a public interest usually fails in the end. There will be more embarrassing disclosures to come. The official narrative is beginning to unwind. Now, I wrote myself a couple of times on blog sites. I admit, I initially said that I was in favour of a lockdown. But I wrote later on that it seemed to me that it brought out the worst in government, with the police set loose on old ladies in a garden, on people sitting on a park bench, and the police, who I have less and less time for these days, revelled in their over-authority, and they behaved like a bunch of Nazi thugs or Stasi from East Germany. It's all the process of they were given power, they were given too much power, and nobody was looking at the results. The lockdown and the damage it has done to this country, as opposed to, say, the lack of a lockdown in Sweden, where they had deaths, but they didn't throw the walls up and chain the gates to the economy. Sweden was far better off during the recovery than anybody in Western Europe or America. And yet, they will not say they were wrong. But there's me, and there's many more like me, who will say one thing and one thing only. If we had anybody else to vote for as an opposition, besides the bloody Labour Party, who were just as guilty as anybody else in the lockdown process, I would vote, and I would continue to hope that everybody else would vote and get this bunch of scum out of Parliament, because we don't need chances in positions of power. I thank you for your time, and I hope to see you again.